So I was thinking about how to revise this talk, given that I was going to be doing it a couple months ago in person at the Gund Institute, Farrell Hall, but things got snowed out, and now I'm not going to be doing it in person. And we've all been looking at a lot of screens lately. And so, given that this is webinar format, and I'll basically be speaking into the void because I can't see anybody else on the call, and I won't be having any of that real-time feedback that I really thrive on when I'm giving a talk. I'm just going to go ahead and try to fly through a bunch of slides here. I'll keep it at a good pace. I'm going to introduce a lot of ideas that I think are really interesting because I'm super passionate about this work. I love to study these pathways to policy impact, and I love to be involved in the practice of helping people find these pathways and create them. And as I grow a little bit older here and approach the end of my 30s, I found myself a little bit more skeptical about theory and convention, and I'm really interested in evidence about what works in practice. So I'm going to be talking a lot about what the research says about how science and policy interact, and also a lot of what I've learned in my experiences on the ground connecting science and policy. And then as I wrap up, I'll talk a little bit about some of the obstacles that I think many of us are familiar with, and some of the resources that hopefully some of which will be new to folks who are on the call today. Y'all remember this place? This is the old home of the Gund Institute. When I first arrived at the Gund back in 2007, I did a graduate work here, started out with a master's and then carried on and did a PhD and worked at the same time I was in graduate school. But along with doing a lot of the research and the data analysis and the methods and publishing papers, the things that had the most transformative impact on me were the experiences where I was able to link the research I was doing with actual decision-making in the real world. And I hope that others have this kind of opportunity too, because it helps take things out of the ether of academia and ground them in decisions that are happening in policy spaces or in the private sector, or the opportunities to collaborate with NGOs who help move policy platforms forward and shape the policy dialogue. So I just wanted to start here with my first time at the Gund was actually back here and in this Johnson House building. Today, the Gund is in a new form and in a new building, and we're all virtual now, but I think fondly of Farrell Hall, where we had a good few months this year, starting out in January, to settle into the new space. And the Gund has a mission now to mobilize scholars and leaders to understand and solve the world's critical environmental problems. There are four main global challenges. Everyone on the call, or most people at least, I think are familiar with these: climate solutions, health and well-being, sustainable agriculture, and resilient communities. And as many of us know, these global challenges reflect the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. What's really interesting about these challenges is that our ability to make progress towards sustainability has a little bit more to do with the application and use of the scientific knowledge we have than on publishing more papers. I think of this as really core to the work that I do. And I'm not saying that science and research is not useful if it's asking fundamental basic questions about how the world works. I think there's lots of reasons why that sort of research is very important and needs to continue. But in terms of solving these problems that society faces, many of these grand sustainability challenges, we don't need to just advance our understanding. We need to consider how the information is used and who's going to be using it. When we don't do this well, we end up creating solutions that are buried in PDFs that nobody ever reads. Really brilliant ideas about what we could be doing better that may as well be entombed in the pyramids because people can't access it, people don't know about it, and it just quietly sits there on a shelf or in a digital PDF that isn't downloaded. And it was interesting to see this headline about a study that the World Bank did looking at their own policy reports over the course of several years and finding that a huge number of them were never downloaded once by anybody, ever, anywhere on the planet. A full third of them were never downloaded once. So one of my goals is to help all of the great research that's happening at the Gund Institute not become one of these PDFs that's buried and that nobody ever reads. How can we get this information out there and help it access policy impact? And here are the main points that I'll carry us through here. And I'm going to keep an eye on the time too and try to move at a rapid clip, but wanted to touch on 4 big ideas here. First is science being more used when it's decision-centered or use-inspired or solution-oriented or whichever buzzword of the day you'd like to insert there. The idea that policymakers use knowledge in particular ways, and we'll unpack that a little bit, understand what types of use are most common. The idea of policy windows, which are those unique opportunities that make uptake of science more likely, how they come about, what we can do if they actually exist, how we recognize them. And then the relationships and networks that are at the heart of this work. And I'm going to question some of the theory and not just take stuff at face value here. So going to that first one, this is a nice way to think about both the quest for fundamental understanding in research and the consideration of how it's used. And when there's really high quest for fundamental understanding, but not a lot of consideration of how it's used, you have very basic sort of research that asks fundamental questions of science. And then example here is Niels Bohr and physicists who are looking at the way atoms are made and how they interact. A little bit more on the high end of considering how the research is used, but not asking as fundamental of a research question would be more applied kind of research like Edison. Engineering often falls in this sort of category. It's very applied, it's actually making things and using the knowledge, but maybe not asking fundamental questions to advance our understanding. And then use-inspired is a separate category that's indicated here that was in this Stokes book from 2011, use-inspired research. So what I wanted to point out here is that all of this research is actually happening somewhere. If you think about the green background for this slide, this is like the broader socio-political context in which the research is happening. And we might even have a third axis coming out of your screen towards you, which has to do with who is involved in the research, who is doing the question asking. And this is a part of the process through which research happens that can really change the context and the governance models that we have and the systems that are in place and how decisions are made. So in practice, as researchers, we're often really well trained in this purely technical focus. We learn how to get the data and the methods right. And people are often really good at this when they come out of an academic training program. But in general, and in practice, many of us are not as good as researchers at focusing on the decision side of things and helping get the policy right. This is an example of where a group has been doing a lot of this work to focus on the decision side. So I'm part of this working group. It's interagency. It's led by folks who are at USGS, which is in the Department of the Interior, and others. And this is about natural capital accounting. And this group, recognize that there's a gap in the information that we have about natural capital, the stocks and the flows of the services that nature provides and the resources that nature provides for people. But they didn't just want to focus on the supply side, right? The missing piece here, was it just that we didn't have the accounting tables, or was it that people didn't know how this information could be useful, or was it both? And so this group has really tried to focus on the who question here. Who are the users of natural capital accounting information? If the group is to be successful about embedding this in the way that decisions are made in government. So we've taken a real stakeholder view of policy. We've thought a lot about the demand for natural capital accounting information. Where does it come from? Who are the people that might use it? How can it be made relevant to their decision contexts and the questions that they're asking and that they're facing? And the same actually is happening right now with an initiative that the Gund Institute is helping lead with the Institute of Environment at the University of Minnesota, focused on developing a state-of-the-state indicator system. And we're doing a lot of early sleuthing right now and engagement with some of the stakeholders and the policy folks who could use the state of the state indicator system. And we're trying to understand how it can be made used and useful in the state level decision processes that already exist and that people are engaged with. And if we think about pathways to impact, they really need to be informed by this context. Not always, but when they are informed by the context, the pathways are a little bit easier to travel. And I think that researchers have a better time finding their way to policy impact if they understand this context. One example of a decision-making context is the Vermont Payment for Ecosystem Services program that is being discussed. So it's not a program currently, but there was a working group set up by the legislature over the last year or so. They've been meeting and discussing, and they delivered a final report in January to the assembly, the state assembly. And GUND has played a critical role in providing the scientific basis for some of the payment for ecosystem services dialogue. But the sticking points aren't really about the need to know more information right now. They're not about, we need more research about a particular aspect of this program or how ecosystem services flow or who benefits. We really are facing sticking points that have to do with the need to make decisions about who will get paid and what they'll get paid and why. And these are political kinds of decisions. They're not neatly answered by standard kind of research. And so in practice, I think we need to keep in mind who is using the research and in what kind of socio-political context. And we need to be really strategic when we think about policy change. And we need to engage with these political and value-laden questions, because if we don't, then we're just going to stay in the world of research and not engage with how policy happens in practice. And I know it's really uncomfortable, these value-laden spaces, for a lot of researchers, but it's where we find the pathways to policy impact. And I'm doing a study right now for the National Academies. It's a commissioned literature review on how science and policy interact in the environment space, the education sector, the health sector, and there is a lot of great research that's happening right now, and more I'm finding that it's detailing the how this kind of thing happens in practice. So I'm really encouraged and excited to be doing that. And I put a recent article that just came out days ago in a special issue of Current Opinion in Environmental Sustainability down there at the bottom. On to the second big topic here, where the theory and the practice don't always align. There's a science-based theory of policy change that until recently was really dominant in academia. The idea that problems are technical and scientific, and research experts will develop appropriate solutions and then just deliver them for the public to accept. In this sort of theory, information is pushed out from the researcher towards users, and politics are irritating. They're seen as just another problem that gets in the way of information being used. In the real world, we don't have quite as rational of a decision-making process going on. We have motivated reasoning. This is the idea that people have a tendency to find arguments that are in favor of the conclusions that they want to believe. And they find arguments that support their conclusions a little bit stronger. And this was a really cool study. They looked at, I think they had about 960 Danish municipal level policymakers as part of this experiment that they did. And if you look at treatment 1 here, the idea was to see how well people could interpret the information that was given to them. And in this case, they're looking at public schools and private schools, or a public school and a private school. And we're using number of satisfied parents as an indicator of whether the school is doing a good job or not. And you'll notice in treatment 1, you can do the math yourself and figure out whether the public school or the private school is doing better according to number of satisfied parents compared to dissatisfied. And then in treatment 2, it's the same setup, but the numbers are flipped. And so in one treatment, public schools doing better, and in another treatment, private schools doing better. What they did next is same exact setup. They just called them School A and School B. And what they also asked people who took these surveys and did this experiment was questions that got at the degree to which somebody thinks that the public government is better at providing services for people than private companies are. And they ran the same thing for roads and asked about public provision of road maintenance versus private companies doing that work. And then they removed public and private to do placebos. And what they found was really interesting. People were less good at interpreting the information if the information was at odds with their prior beliefs. So they could not get the right answer as often if the right answer was that a private school is better, but people already held the belief that private schools would not be as good as public schools. And this has been shown with lots of different research. It's really fascinating stuff. One of the things I like about this study is that they also showed that not only are politicians human, but when they gave people more information, they actually tested giving them 1, 3, or 5 pieces of information. The more information they gave people to try and interpret stuff correctly, the stronger the effect. The less likely they were to answer the right question if it was at odds, or answer the question correctly if it was at odds with their prior beliefs. So more information actually did not help in this case. And I see this all the time in the real world too, in practice. There have been more and more studies of how knowledge is used in decision-making, in Congress, in Parliament, in other settings as well. And it's fascinating to find through a lot of these interviews and surveys that are done with decision makers that oftentimes they don't even distinguish between different kinds of knowledge or between different kinds of evidence. Scientific knowledge and other kinds of knowledge, other sort of evidence in decision making is just held to be the same. You know, public opinion versus scientific knowledge, something you heard online in a blog versus something that was published in a rigorous research journal. And I would question why we don't have better standards of evidence in decision-making in public policy spaces. There's a thing I've learned about from a friend who's a lawyer who mentioned that there's a thing called the Daubert standard. And this is the way in which in the court of law, in federal judicial processes in this country and in some others, there are standards of evidence when it comes to scientific expert testimony. And they've tried to be careful about what kind of information a judge is using or a jury is using to make a decision. A judge may not be a scientific expert, so they need to rely on scientific expertise, and that is codified in precedent and in law. And we don't have that in policy spaces, and I don't know why. I think it would be challenging to get it to come about, but I'd love to chat with anybody at any point who is a lawyer who would be interested in looking into that a little bit more with me. So knowledge is used in many different kinds of ways, and we find that conceptual use is one of the most common, if not the most common way that research knowledge is used in decision-making. And this came about from Weiss back in the 70s, who noticed that research could really have this enlightenment function, is what she called it, that it could shape beliefs and understanding, provide new ideas and frameworks, and influence how policymakers, both individually and collectively, consider issues and evaluate potential solutions. So keep this in mind when you're thinking about how your research might be used. It might not be a really clear-cut, tangible kind of use that you can point to and say, look, that specific decision wielded this information like a tool to make the right decision based on the evidence. It might just be that the dialogue is being shaped by the research if it follows a pathway to have impact on policy. And this is exactly what I saw when, in this case, a Gund graduate fellow, Adrian, testified to a state of Vermont legislative study committee about wetlands law in Vermont. So Adrian's a real expert in this area of wetlands and how they function. We had an invitation for somebody from the GUND to testify before this committee. Adrian was the perfect person for it, and he did an amazing job. And thanks to his bringing of research to bear on the policy conversation that was happening, the final report from this study committee reflected a lot of his ideas and other ideas from GUND researchers and others about the value of wetlands in terms of the services that they provide. And these are state lawmakers who are on the House Ag Committee, the Senate Ag Committee, the House Natural Resources Committee, and the Senate Natural Resources Committee. And for them to reflect this sort of conceptual use of the research about wetlands and the services they provide was a perfect example. So there are many different types of evidence, scientific research just being one, often not being distinguished from other types of evidence in policy settings. There are different types of use that we observe, and instrumental use is really key, whether here in Bridport, the town of Bridport on the west side of Vermont, in the town hall, or here in the India Treaty Room in the Eisenhower building in the executive office building right next to the White House. Conceptual use, really key. So in theory, we also see a lot of research about policy windows, and these are proposed as opportunities for knowledge uptake and decision-making. There are certain moments in time where things are ripe and knowledge uptake is more likely. And I would say absolutely. This is one of those things in practice that we see all the time. When I brought a group to DC, a group of scientists, economists, ecologists, social scientists who are trained in anthropology and psychology, and we engaged the federal government within the executive branch on the idea that the ocean provides many different types of benefits to humans, and that we need to use the resources and these benefits carefully and thoughtfully. This was framed to be in line with policy windows that had opened up. I had heard from people who were in different positions within the executive office of the president that there was some talk about the oceans being seen as a profit center, and this opportunity to really expand our extraction of resources and our exploration of the ocean. So we framed things in line with that policy window. And there has been some indication that some of this work was really valuable and useful for framing policy dialogue. Another example of a policy window and responding quickly to one when it does open was when I was back there in the Johnson House where I started this talk, studying the Genuine Progress Indicator. And as I was getting into the early stages of digging in on the research in my graduate studies here, I learned that in the Department of Natural Resources in the state of Maryland, Governor O'Malley at the time had made an executive order that the GPI would be measured and reported by the state. And so I took that opportunity and responded quickly, and I was able to collaborate with DNR in Maryland and do my study in parallel, but separately and independently from the Maryland study, and then compare our results and see if we came up with the same sort of findings. And it was a great example of a window opening without, I was not aware that it was going to happen, and then I needed to be quick in responding to it. And another example of this quick response, which is really key when you're trying to find a pathway to policy impact, was just a couple months ago, and I was in DC. Had a chance interaction with someone who's deputy counsel for the US Senate Committee on Energy and Natural Resources, learned that there was some interest in the topic of biomass, and then turned quickly, pivoted to some GUND fellows, Bill Keaton and others. It was really encouraging to see how quickly folks responded and were able to get research and really clear answers to the questions that the decision-making group had in front of people who were in positions to be able to use that research and help shape the way this committee is thinking about biomass resources. In the literature, there's some great tips for how to make use of policy windows, to frame research in line with the appropriate windows, responding quickly, persevering in closed windows, and then foreseeing and creating emergent windows. And it's really hard to anticipate where things are going and when these windows are going to open and what they'll look like. So I encourage people to rely on experts who are in the field. That is how many of us are able to find these pathways. So I'm going to wrap up here pretty quickly, but I just wanted to go through one more piece from theory and compare it to what we see in practice. And this is abundant in the literature, that relationships are really key to how science impacts policy. And I would say definitely. If we think about how scientists and decision makers can be arranged, you can see on the right, the dark line is for scientists, the gray line for decision makers, and the dashed line for intermediaries. These are different ways that knowledge exchange happens. The co-production model, which is being talked about more and more, an embedding model, where a scientist or a decision maker is embedded into an organization where the other one is dominant. And this looks like the AAAS Science and Policy Fellows, and there's lots of fellowships that do this kind of thing. Knowledge broker model, where you have an intermediary who is really accountable to, in this case, the scientist community, but is helping broker the knowledge and the exchange with the decision makers. And then a boundary organization model, where the intermediary really has lines of accountability to either community and is situated a little more in between them to facilitate that exchange. But what are these circles? You know, what do they actually represent? And in the real world, in practice, they represent organizations and people. These are people interacting. These are individuals who are sitting at the table and are arranged often in networks. And policy is the result of these complex dynamic interactions among people, right? We have governments, but we really need to appreciate governance and the networks of many actors that help make policy happen. I don't have time to go into the details of some of the practical research about how networks change as a result of research engaging with policy, but I'll just point to Brian Chaffin here at University of Montana, who does really neat work in this regard. And I'll mention that this is a really brief story that I'll mention, which I think is valuable because it has to do with different kinds of knowledge being a part of the networks and the governance that happens. And this was a case out in the Haida Gwaii in the west coast of British Columbia. And this is a case where traditional ecological knowledge in science came to be really valued and used in a decision-making setting. And it was a tribal elder who was trading stories with a fisheries scientist, thanks to this ocean modeling forum at University of Washington, which held a space for this to happen. And they learned that, you know, the tribal elder for many years, he and his friends and family have been observing that herring populations, the young ones will follow the older fish to the spawning sites. And in places where there used to be spawns, but there weren't now, it was because the older fish had been all fished out. And so the younger ones could not go with the older fish. They didn't know where to go to spawn. And these stories were taken and translated into the mathematical models that are used in stock assessments and in understanding how many fish are out there and what age classes they're in, et cetera. And now this traditional ecological knowledge is actually being used in stock assessments and in decisions about management of these fish populations. So it's a really great example of how different types of knowledge can be used as long as the spaces are created for the interaction to occur. And this gets at another really key piece here, which is about how it's not just relationships between people, it's relationships that people have with the knowledge. And I'll just say with this slide that there's been a lot of work around whether the knowledge is more likely to be used if it's salient, credible, and legitimate. And I would say not always. We see a lot of knowledge today being used in decision-making in the executive branch and elsewhere that I would say is not legitimate knowledge at all, not credible, not scientifically credible or otherwise. So these are not sufficient in their own, and they're not even present in a lot of decision-making cases these days. But really importantly, who's to say? This is really about people's perception of the research knowledge and their power dynamics in there. And it takes trust built up over time for decision makers to see research knowledge as salient or credible or legitimate. And in today's world, there's just widespread erosion of trust and expertise in general, I would say. So really briefly, as I wrap up, and apologies for going a little over the half-hour mark, there's lots of obstacles here. So when trying to find these pathways to policy impact, people have different kinds of access based on who they are, right? What career stage you are, your gender, etc. This can impact whether somebody has access or what kinds of risks are faced as you're trying to find pathways to impact. And I only bring this up because it's the reality in practice that I've seen happen, and it's important to keep in mind. There are institutional barriers, siloed organizations, institutional cultures, lack of incentives, and mindsets that can really make impact elusive. And then there's messiness. And what do I mean by messiness? We have the mythical policy cycle here, which begins often with agenda setting and goes through this process of creating a policy. But in reality, rather than waiting for one of these neat policy cycles or opportunities to emerge, you might expect something a little more like this. I've seen plenty of policy cycles that look a little more like this chaotic trajectory. And if we want to have knock-on effects, we really need to partner with others, navigators, champions, allies. Policy change can be the result of coalitions that are organized behind a particular approach. So you need to think strategically about what your goals are. This is just really quickly a few tips from an expert policy entrepreneur who was at the White House for many years. Just learned about this excellent guidance from the Day One project that I've been a part of. And then I wanted to end on just mentioning what the goals are for this policy outreach program that we've really developed at the Gund Institute with the help of many different people. We're aiming to connect fellows with external leaders in policy, the private sector, and civil society organizations, because we see these three groups as really critical to how policy change can happen. We're creating strategic partnerships. And one of my main goals is also just building capacity to more effectively engage. So there's lots of resources available at the Gund and elsewhere. We've got policy briefs we're developing. I've got how-to guidance so you can write your own policy brief. Trying to build on the reputation Gund has in Vermont and beyond as a trusted resource. And I encourage people to think about their professional societies as resources too. And also look into these NGOs here, AAAS, the Alda Center, Compass, Evidence for Democracy. These groups are doing great work with fellowships, trainings, and other kinds of resources for researchers who want to find pathways to policy impact. And on that note, I'll wrap it up and stop sharing my screen. Thank you all for your attention today. I really appreciate it. And I'll turn towards the Q&A session. Hopefully folks are interested in this work, and I look forward to hearing what kind of questions have popped up in people's minds. So
thank you, Stephen, for this very, very informative and very interesting talk. I think this is something that, so many scientists need to be aware of. At this time, I would like to encourage everyone to ask questions via the Q&A box, and I'm going to go ahead and share with them. And I think we do have a couple. So the first one was, so Jeremy is curious about if anyone has tried to investigate why more information didn't help regarding the study of the schools, and if so, why? Was it because too much information was confusing or hard to synthesize?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I don't know the answer. I believe it has to do with when people are faced with more information, exactly that. It can be a little more confusing, and I think people react to additional information by just kind of doubling down on their prior beliefs and attitudes. And so it doesn't actually shift their minds. It just leads to them feeling more strongly about those conclusions they're looking for that show that they're right. Good question.
Our second question is, if you could give examples of all 4 of the relationship models. You mentioned that AAAS for the concentric circles. What about the other 3?
Yeah, good question. I'm going to pull them up so I can make sure that I hit on all 4 proper ones. So the co-production model, an example of that would be, there's lots of really good examples. I'm having a hard time thinking of one particular one to pop into mind right now, but I would say that, work by the Lenfest Ocean program has used the co-production approach quite a bit, where the researchers are at a very early stage in their process engaging with decision makers, so that the very questions they're asking in their research are informed by decision makers. So they're co-produced. In that way, that the whole process is kind of collaborative. There's a lot more iterative exchange, not just once or twice or a couple times throughout the research process, and not just at the end, but researchers and decision makers co-producing together, and iterative interaction happening throughout. Embedding, yeah, I think the AAAS fellowship is a great example of that. Also, in Vermont, there are legislative intern opportunities for undergraduates at UVM that I think are really cool, and give undergrads maybe who may have science backgrounds the chance to actually work closely with decision makers at the state level. Knowledge brokers is the third arrangement. And this is where I think professional societies often have this kind of model. So you've got the knowledge broker who is really accountable to one particular group, in this case, a professional society, maybe the Ecological Society of America, for example. And so their policy staff, they're really accountable to Ecological Society of America, but they're brokering an exchange of the knowledge from ESA researchers and members to decision makers, and helping translate that knowledge and build those relationships. And then boundary organizations, I would say Compass, the nonprofit organization Compass, is one of the best examples of this, which is where I previously worked. And we did a lot of work where, we weren't accountable to just the scientist side of things or just the policy side of things. We were brokering relationships and accountable to both groups, and really trying to span the boundary between them, because they're like professional communities that have boundaries and don't always interact. So hopefully that's helpful with some specific examples.
I'm going to move to the next one. So Stephen, this was excellent. Thank you so much for sharing. I have some interviews with extensions agents that reflect some of what you've talked about. I wonder if there is research about what enables the development of critical relationships and trust building you mentioned near the latter portion of your talk. How can institutions like UVM put value and resources towards relationship and trust building? What are the leverage points to enhance those relationships and trust?
I love that question. And the way it was phrased early on in my mind, I felt myself getting pulled into, what does the research say about this? But I'm going to just stay in the world of practice and remind myself that, I want to do business with people that I like. I think just having a friendly disposition and interacting with people in a real way on the level is a key part to relationship building. So, an Australian colleague once said, "Oh, you just got to take the decision maker out for a beer." And that's how it happens sometimes, right? Is just interacting normally and having a conversation and sharing and learning about somebody and just trying to see things through their eyes and know what they're facing. What is that decision maker concerned about or focused on or hopeful about? And how can the research intersect with their interests? So on a practical level, I think that those are good kind of approaches. And I think the research would support that. You know, the processes that help build trust often have to do with, from what I've seen, creating platforms and spaces in which interaction can happen in like a confidential kind of safe sort of way. So yeah, and I'd love to hear from others too, either through the chat or elsewhere, if they have seen research about that.
Great. Well, the next one is from Kenna. How do we as scientists engage with policymakers in a compelling way, despite the tendency of people to disregard evidence that goes against their values? Thinking of controversial political discussions like climate action, conservation, etc.
Yeah, it's such a good question, and and so relevant to what we see a lot these days in policy settings. I'll just say that the only way to assure that scientific evidence is dismissed is to not have it at the table, right? To not bring it to bear on the research, on the policy conversations, and to not engage. So I encourage people to engage anyway, even if there's the chance that it might be dismissed or misused or misinterpreted. Given that people tend to be fixed in their beliefs or their attitudes about something, you know, I think it's very important to carefully frame the research in a way that will make sense to the decision maker, and that that could potentially align with what they do care about. You know, you don't have to lead with climate change, and I'm not saying that it's a word you can't use, but maybe it's about how precipitation patterns are shifting, and maybe that's what really matters to the decision maker, because they're representing a lot of rural agricultural communities. And the words climate change can be a part of the conversation at some point, but rather than leading with that, one could lead with how precipitation patterns are changing, and that has implications for irrigation and the way we manage soil, and the viability of certain kinds of farming and that sort of thing. So I think just framing the research messages is super important and key.
Great.
Hopefully
So
that's
let me go ahead, and we have so many questions.
Thanks, Rosie. Thanks for curating them and answering or asking them on behalf of people.
So the next one is, so great presentation. As scientists, we often get frustrated that decision makers don't want to consider information around factors such as uncertainty. It has occurred to me that those of us in research don't appreciate the challenges of making decisions quickly with limited information. Should we think about training researchers in rapid decision making so we better appreciate the environment that politicians work in?
Yes, I think so. I think that could be really valuable training. I've found, having led a lot of trainings of that sort in the past, that it's really impactful when you bring policymakers in to help lead the trainings and speak from their point of view and share insights from their world, like what it's like to be a policymaker. Because it's one thing for me to say on behalf of a policymaker what it's like, but it's a whole nother one to have those people in the room giving real-time feedback to how a researcher is practicing delivering a message. And I'll also add that on the flip side, I only know of one training for decision makers about how to use scientific evidence in decision making. And I think more of that could be really valuable too. You know, there's a group called the Bipartisan Policy Institute that's done some really neat work on how we can build more evidence-based decision-making support structures. And I think there needs to be more on both sides of that exchange for us to be able to more effectively, you know, have smarter decisions, basically.
So next question, we have great presentation with a lot of great insight. I'm trying to envision how to apply it to our context here. So in Vermont, what do you think are the main leverage points for policy change for sustainability? And where do you see that UVM scholars can help with that?
Awesome question. And I'm only I only have a limited perspective, and in my role with the Gund Institute, I'm connecting research to decision making in Vermont, federally and internationally. So my plate is full of lots of different decision contexts and kinds of research. So when I think about just Vermont, I would say there's a lot of opportunities these days in things like nature-based solutions. And the Gund Institute has done some really great work in partnership with the Nature Conservancy of Vermont on framing what those look like, what it means to have more nature-based solutions kind of thinking in policy, and how we can prioritize strategies that capitalize on nature-based solutions, things like flood control and erosion control using the natural systems that already do these kinds of things really well, rather than building gray infrastructure type solutions all the time. Other spaces that I think Gund could really contribute today, I feel like there's a huge opportunity for the Gund Institute and people at UVM to be center in the conversations around how to rebuild the economy in Vermont as we begin to increasingly reopen. How can we design systems and governance and the economy to be smarter and to be better than it was before we all chose to close it down? And there's some early indication that there may be opportunities to have those kinds of conversations, but I would encourage people to to step up in this time, when the time is right, when we're not in a very urgent kind of emergency mindset of needing to deal with the tragic nature of what's unfolding with COVID-19. I think we definitely need to do that, but I think we simultaneously need to prepare to have the bigger conversations about how can we rebuild to be better. And I think Gund and UVM can help lead some of that work in the future.
So our next question is, what relationship do you think researchers can and should have with advocacy organizations who may be able to help communicate and elevate research and science?
I love that question. And I'll just say first that I support researchers engaging in any kind of role that they would like to play in a policy situation. I myself think it's really important that I don't take a very strongly advocacy-oriented approach to my work because I need to continue to be a trusted resource to all parties. And I'm not in the business of saying which solution I think is best or pushing for a particular solution. But I do acknowledge that researchers get to make that choice for themselves about how they want to show up in policy spaces, and I support them in whatever role they want to play. I think that advocacy-oriented organizations are really critical in helping raise awareness about issues and providing some of that perseverance when policy windows are closed. They can provide that persistent sort of push about an issue being important and the need to take action on it. And I think they're really critical. They're huge sources of information about issues. I think most savvy decision makers recognize advocacy-oriented people and organizations pretty quickly, and they're constantly receiving information from people who are advocating for something. So it's totally normal and there's nothing wrong with it. And I think that, a researcher that wants to be more, less advocacy oriented can help uncover and provide a view about what issues are really important. And then an advocacy organization can take that and help push forward with proposed recommendations and solutions for solving the problem. So I think that there's different roles that can be played, and I think they're complementary in most cases. And there are also particular risks with whichever role a researcher wants to play. So that's part of the part of what I think of when I hear that question as well. It's a really good question.
I think we have a couple minutes for maybe 2 more questions. So if you work in a system that involves national and international stakeholders, and a change in policy would require change in a commodity market and various cultural shifts. So some examples could be biodiversity conservation and coffee production. What's a good standing point to transition local specific research into policy inspired research?
So in an international space where there is a shift in commodity markets like coffee and biodiversity, what was the very last piece?
So what's a good standing point to transition local specific research into policy inspired research?
Yeah, I would suggest that it's really important to know the policy scene in that area, wherever it is, and to understand how things are organized, who does what, who has jurisdiction over a particular potential action, who would be able to change things, and then to think carefully about how to engage with those people and those parts of the policy scene there. Biodiversity can be a really challenging thing because it doesn't often show up on the radar when people are talking about commodity prices and market fluctuations and market forces and purely economic sorts of decision making. So that by itself could be a challenge, but I would say just thinking really carefully about who can do what to improve things, and then you could even think about the role of government and the many different ways that that government can even be like a buyer of commodities, and that in itself can be a policy that really jumpstarts a market or shifts the way that things are happening, right? Governments buy tons of stuff. They could buy electric vehicle charging stations, for example. So just thinking carefully about the policy scene there, I would love for whoever asked that to let me know if they want to chat about it at some point. Be curious.
Yeah. So this is more like a comment / kind of question. So regarding trust of information sources, it also brings up the question of how to deal with entities that are actively trying to erode trust in credible data.
Such a good question. And these days there are very sophisticated and elaborate, I would say, like campaigns to spread misinformation and erode trust in certain kinds of expertise and in science. The strategy, there's really clear strategies, and I can't think of what they are right now, but I would recommend people to, I would be happy to follow up on that, because there's like playbooks about how misinformation is used to spread doubt and sow the seeds of uncertainty among the public. And a lot of the playbooks were developed by over many years, but you can look back at tobacco, and you can look at climate change, and you can look at what's happening today, and you can see patterns in the way that people are spreading misinformation and trying to cast doubt on the science. But there are ways to illuminate those attempts and to just uncover them and shed light on them, and then to counter them with really careful strategies. And I can't think of what I'm like envisioning this playbook that I just came across the other day, and I can't picture what they have like 4 strategies, and it's just escaping my mind right now, but I'd be happy to follow up about it with anyone who's interested.
Sounds good. So our last question, really concise, informative walkthrough of your approach. Thanks, Stephen. I'm curious about standards for relationships between research teams and policymakers, especially with respect to understanding implications for power asymmetries. It seems that sometimes economists or ecologists aren't always the most qualified for understanding the implications of knowledge framing and solutions for marginalized groups. are there standards for that the GUND or other groups follow for including that perspective in their engagement with politicians or other actors?
Such a good question. So important to keep that front in mind, and to use that as a lens to evaluate what we're doing and how we're going about this work. There at the Gund Institute, diversity and equity and inclusion are core principles of what we do. And in my own work, I've tried to be as careful as possible about making sure I'm bringing different sorts of scientists of looking at diversity across many different dimensions, including disciplinary diversity and diversity of thought, to make opportunities for folks to engage with policy. And I'll just say that I don't know of any standards that exist, but it's a really good question that's prompting me to look into whether there are examples of other groups doing this really well. And in my own experience, bringing economists and other types of social scientists to meet with policymakers, it's often the folks who are not economists who have really great insights that the policymakers are wowed by. And research by anthropologists about why farmers aren't showing up to a particular kind of meeting that's supposed to be representative and serving them about how to manage water resources, for example. So some of those insights are found to be just as critical and valuable in the minds of policymakers. Hopefully that's useful.
Thank you. And I'm pretty sure people can contact you if they have any additional questions.
Yeah, absolutely. I think most everybody knows how to find me, so I encourage you to reach out and look forward to keeping the conversation going. Thank you so much, Rosie.
Awesome.
I appreciate
Thank you. Thank you for a great talk.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Hope you have a great weekend. Take care.